Welcome back to the Political Dispatch. In part one, we explored the intricacies of Emmanuel Macron's presidency, his relationship with the media, and the French electoral system with Dr. Charles Devellennes.
In part two, we continue our deep dive into the recently concluded French elections. Dr. Devellennes will shed light on the broader political landscape of France, explaining how the Fifth Republic is designed and discussing the future of the National Rally. With a significant gain in seats, the National Rally has emerged as a formidable force in French politics, poised to influence key policy decisions and challenge Macron's agenda.
We'll also examine Macron's economic vision for the country and consider what French philosophers might think of modern France. Additionally, we'll touch on the recent Labour victory in the UK, analysing how the shift in British politics might affect relations with France and the broader European Union. Lastly, we'll delve into the implications of French election results for the UK and the EU.
Stay tuned as we continue our in-depth analysis of one of the most pivotal elections in Europe.
And that's fascinating because Macron basically keeps screwing the left over in that, when he gets the presidency, he then just completely ignores any of their policies. And then again, it's this claiming of a victory, similar in the sense of, the media in the UK presenting Labour's landslide win. Yes, it is a landslide, but the majorities of so many of those MPs are so thin. If we think of even key people like Wes Streeting, a majority of about 600, I really struggle with the oversimplification of what victory means in politics. It's just a breather from then another incident that happens sort of later down the line. And I suppose it's the same with Biden in the US. It stopped Trump for a bit, and now he's more, he's jumped in the polls and all that sort of thing. So that's all fascinating.
Yeah, there's also one thing that's quite ironic, just to add a little detail, is that the previous government, so from 2022 to 24, had a minority in parliament. So now, Macron and his allies are saying we can't possibly give power to the left because they're a minority government. But this is how they've run France in the past 2 years, with a minority government. So that is quite ironic in how politics work. You just emerge from a minority government and you say, "Oh no, we can't possibly have one," when it's the opposition that has come out on top in the election.
And am I right in understanding that the French voting public are very good at making it challenging for their president? So they might give their president a majority in terms of re-electing in Macron's case, but then holding them back in terms of the majority in parliament. Is that a relatively good assessment of how it works?
It has happened, but usually in those in those snap elections, or we used to have kind of midterm elections, if you want. This was reformed about 20 years ago, but it used to be very common to have midterms elections. We can also think of Jacques Chirac, when he was in power, his second term as president, I believe he was no, I think it was his first term as president in 1997. He dissolved the National Assembly because he thought, I'm going to get a bigger majority in the National Assembly, and actually the left won that election. So he had to have a cohabitation government with Lionel Jospin, who was the prime minister at the time from the Socialist Party, and he had to live with the socialists for basically 5 years. Right? So he was the president, but he had a socialist prime minister. But we reformed the law after that to make sure it doesn't happen again. Right? So we synced basically the presidential and the legislative elections, so that just after you've elected the president, a month later, you have legislative elections. And the French people tend to give the majority to the president. I say that then because it didn't quite happen in 2022. When Macron's allies lost their majority in parliament after Macron was re-elected. But it didn't stop him really from ruling, and partially, and then there's a much longer story about the French Fifth Republic. But the French Fifth Republic is essentially designed to run without the parliament. It sounds very weird to say that like a democracy is designed to run without parliament, but at least the French Fifth Republic has what we call like rationalized the parliament. So it's made it much harder for parliament to obstruct the actions of the government, even when the government is in a minority. So the irony is that a minority government is precisely what the Fifth Republic was created to make work, right? And that's why you have such provisions as Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, which allows the Prime Minister to pass any law in Parliament without a vote. So that provision was very unpopular over the pensions reform, because it was used to pass it, because there wasn't a majority in the National Assembly for it. And the only thing the Parliament can do then is a no confidence vote. So it can make the entire government fall, but that requires an absolute majority. So that means that, if someone doesn't turn up in the National Assembly, they're essentially voting with the government. Right? So you would need 289 members of the National Assembly to bring down a government, irrespective of how many of them turn up that day. Right? So it's a very tall order. You basically require the entire opposition to turn up and vote for the no confidence vote. And Macron was essentially saved by the Republicans there, because the Republicans never voted for the no confidence vote as a group. Some of them did individually, but not as a group. So it was very difficult to bring him down. But the Fifth Republic is designed to run a minority government, because when it was created, that was one of the big problems of the Fourth Republic that came before it, is that it was very chaotic and governments would fall all the time. And so the people who drafted the Fifth Republic's constitution decided, we're going to make sure the parliament is too weak to bring down government, at least easily. It has the power to do so, but it's very difficult, much more difficult than in other democracies. And so one small example of this imbalance is also that the president appoints the prime minister. So now we have the same prime minister as before the election. He's staying on. He offered his resignation on Monday morning, and it was refused by the president. But Macron can appoint anyone he wants to the office of prime minister. Right? He is under no obligation to offer it to the left, and under no obligation to offer it to any of the political parties, really. He could appoint anyone that he wishes, senior civil servants, for example. And this is one of the options that's being floated, that absent a majority, if the three blocs cannot work together, he could appoint a technical government. So he could appoint someone who's from outside of politics in order to run the day-to-day business, and then they'd try to get a majority for each bill as they need to pass them, or at least to gain enough support so that they could avoid a no-confidence vote. So that would be the strict minimum that they try to do. So we'd be in a very difficult situation constitutionally, because the president has so much power, because he can appoint the prime minister, and then the prime minister can pass any law without a vote. So it's a system that is designed to be, very anti-democratic, right? By design. Whatever the people vote isn't supposed to bring down the republic. The republic must go on, even if the people are voting for crazy people in the National Assembly.
Wow, that's bonkers. I didn't even realize it's designed to be weak, which is interesting. Whereas I suppose in the UK system, it's always sort of been designed that Parliament is sort of the supreme overseer of it all. But obviously,
Parliament is sovereign, right, in the UK.
Yeah.
So when we had the Brexit referendum, Parliament needed to vote for Brexit, because the referendum is worthless as a piece of paper unless Parliament votes for it, because Parliament is sovereign. This is not the case in France. Parliament is not sovereign.
What role do you think the National Rally will play in politics over the next few years? Because we've got the presidential election in a couple of years. So now they've got this, much larger presence. I mean, this is a bit like Reform winning 150, 200 seats in the British Parliament, and some. What role are they playing now, do you think, or will they?
Yeah, so I mean, they're very much in the opposition. There's very little chance that they end up in government. I say very little because I don't discount it altogether. Ideologically, they have more points in common with Macron than any other combination of the three blocs. Right? So this is the combination that I think would make the most sense, ideologically speaking, but politically very unpalatable. So they voted together on a number of issues already in the past. So laws on immigration, for example, they're very happy to vote the same laws, basically. So that's not, that wouldn't be a very big obstacle. But, from someone who's been elected to keep them out of power and has promised to keep them out of power, to give them the keys to the nation, so to speak, would be very politically dangerous for him. So I think there's a very low chance that they end up in government. So they're going to be in the opposition now until the next presidential elections in 27. But there could be another snap election. So it's possible. Can't happen for another year, but the president can only call it once a year under the powers of the Constitution. So maybe we'll be talking again next year after another round of elections, and maybe it would be quite different. I think it would be also, imagining the kind of most likely scenario, a kind of, Macron not giving power to the left, right, which seems to be his preference at the moment, refusing to give power to the left. Then he would have to have another kind of minority government running France. And I think this would immediately be perceived by voters on the left as a betrayal. This wouldn't be the first time, but this would be a big one. This would be a big one in the sense that what's the point in transferring votes to Macron if he immediately then turns to you and says, you are not a good citizen, right? I won't even contemplate having a coalition with a party that so many of you voted for, which is La France Insoumise. All right, so it seems like Macron and his allies are willing to have a coalition with parts of the left, but not La France Insoumise. And so they're singling out one of the parties. Fortunately, they don't dictate who ends up in that coalition. So it's for the left to stay strong, right, and to stay together, and to refuse that kind of reading of the elections. But this is Macronism, right, that we were talking about, this kind of capturing the center left and the center right and working with everyone. He would also need Les Républicains, so the kind of the conservative party in France. And they've been very clear that they don't want anything to do with the coalition because they know it's political suicide. Some people in the Socialists and in the Greens have hinted they could, but I think the leadership of both parties has been also extremely clear that this is not what they're going to be doing. They're not going to suddenly turn around and join Macron when they essentially were elected on a program. The left's program was a break from Macron's politics, very much to the left. I would say very classic social democratic program. So tax and spend, right? They want to spend a lot of money on public services, on civil servants, on creating the conditions for investing in infrastructure, but they want to tax the much richer elements in French society, those that have benefited from huge tax breaks for the past 7 years, essentially. So a kind of rebalancing, but social democratic. It's not going to be a revolution in France. There's not going to be a kind of upheaval of the French political class. If you compare it with the kind of the joint program of the socialists and the communists of 1981, this is even before I was born, but this joint program was much more radical, right? And they got elected, and they ran France, and France survived, right? Of course, they didn't apply all of their program, but you kind of expect that anyway. Politicians, even if they're the best intentions, they can't necessarily do everything that they wanted. So the left's program is very classic social democratic, tax and spend, and is being vilified as this kind of, it's impossible to run this kind of program in a modern day economy, when essentially, if you look across the Atlantic, this is what Biden has been doing, right, for the past 4 years. And for all the controversy over his person, the kind of politics that they've done is kind of classic social democratic tax and spend. So very similar in those terms. Not the kind of Bolshevik revolution that many call it.
And obviously, I mean, Biden's agenda is to modernize America, because I don't think a lot of people that maybe just see the superficial side of US in the politics, or maybe take an interest when the president gets elected, is that America's infrastructure has been falling massively behind. And I don't know what the state of the infrastructure is largely in France, but and you know, semiconductors, investments in building the economy for the future. Is that what Macron is trying to do with his economic policies? Is he trying to build towards that, or is it more of a situation where he's just building something in his image of a sort of neoliberal type setup?
Yeah, there's not much public investment under Macron. So there were a few programs on building French tech. So that's his thing, is basically to have more of a French tech angle. So he opened this new kind of campus for tech companies in Paris, in an old railway station. So that kind of thing. So yeah, that kind of small scale projects, a few billion in kind of innovative investment, boosting here and there, but nothing like the scale of what's been happening in the US, even by comparison, right? Even if you took it as purchasing power, and like France is a much smaller economy than the US, but yeah, no, nothing like that. So yeah, he's been talking a lot about investing in education and investing in research, but he hasn't really put the money behind it. So that the people who also voted for him for those reasons have been disappointed, because he really hasn't done it for this constituency in particular. People who might otherwise think, actually, this is great, like this is working. So unfortunately, nothing on that scale, and there's not really been an industrial strategy in Macron. So just to give you a very short example, he's completely flip-flopped on nuclear energy. Right? So he used to be against it, and now he's all for it. And it shows you that he didn't have an idea, for what is it to run a modern economy for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Everyone thinks we're going to need more electricity, right? We hope to run our cars on electricity, and we hope to grow the economy through AI and other things that are very energy intensive. And he hasn't really had a kind of a vision for this. And he's easily been swayed by various arguments on one side or another, which is not good for stability for a sector that needs massive investment, right? So France has a world-leading nuclear energy industry, and if you signal that you want to move away from it, then that's potentially dangerous for the industry. There may be good reasons to do it, right? The left is very critical of nuclear energy, and they have their own vision about this. But for the sector, it's very disruptive. They might think, is it worth investing more in France? Because all of it is kind of semi-public, semi-private. So they could think of other avenues and building nuclear reactors in the UK, for example. So yeah, I think on that, unfortunately, he doesn't have a clear industrial strategy. What does it mean to build a French economy for the future, other than let's have more unicorns? Like, okay, so we want more big companies that rise from 0 to 1 billion in value. Yeah, great. I mean, who doesn't want that? But that's not an industrial strategy. That's not providing the backbone of the economy so that this happens, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something we've suffered from in the UK as well. And maybe it'll change under Labour, and they seem to be, but who knows? France is known for its great philosophers and thinkers. What do you think people like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Foucault would make of this moment in French political history?
It's a good question. I think they would think very. I mean, it's different thinkers, right? But let's take the least French of all to start with, like Rousseau, because he's from Geneva. Um, he he was very much a defender of democracy, right? So if you read like the social contract, he's very much someone who wants to see a much more participative democracy. And what we've seen under Macron is actually a very top-down model of democracy, where everything goes through the president. And maybe because he didn't have to be a mayor, he didn't have to be, a member of the National Assembly before that, before he became president. So I think that's a very clear lesson from the French Fifth Republic, is that it's not very democratic, but Macron has made it even less democratic. It used to rely on intermediary bodies, and it used to have much more dialogue between parties and the president, etc. And you see it really just in the recent decision by Macron to dissolve the National Assembly, is that the people that were hurt the most by it were members of parliament from his own party. Right? And he didn't talk to them about it before he decided. He didn't consult them. He didn't even warn them. And they learned about it in the French media. And so that is a very big failure of democracy, even just at the representative level, without thinking too much about how to get individual citizens involved. Even just at the very kind of structural level of French democracy, it was hugely damaging. And you see that he didn't care much about the people that have been working for him for the past 7 years. He was willing to risk their future in order to achieve a very short-term goal, which was to, as he said, I threw a live grenade at the feet of my opponents. Right? That's how he described his decision to call the snap election, because he saw that there was a unique opportunity to catch his opponents unaware. And he knew he might have to face an early election anyway. And so he decided to do it as soon as possible when they're not ready. And unfortunately, his troops were not ready either. So, this is a commander throwing a live grenade among his enemies, but also his friends. And that is hugely damaging. So I think someone like Rousseau would have been appalled by this kind of politicking. Voltaire is, he's kind of an interesting figure because he's much more moderate in his Enlightenment thinking. He believed that maybe we could have like a kind of enlightened monarch. So maybe to an extent he would have been a supporter of Macron. I don't want to attack Voltaire too much. I find him the most hilarious of 18th century writers. I have my favorites, and he's the funniest. If you read Candide, you will laugh so much. It's actually quite hilarious as a book. But he's quite moderate in his politics, and I think the kind of middle of the roads / center right that Macron was proposing would have been fine for him. And Foucault last. I talk a lot about Foucault in my book on Macron. That actually there's a very excellent critique of the security state by Foucault in his lectures at the Collège de France. And I used his writings on security to really analyze deep down how Macron was using security during his first term in office. And one thing that really struck me was Foucault's writing on pandemics, right? And that was quite surprising because I was writing this basically during the pandemic, and that he was analyzing the way that political power was rising and how the kind of the security state, the nexus between the state and security was built on reaction to pandemics, and that it was the desire to control these kinds of epidemic pandemics. So these recurring diseases that were happening to the population that led to what we can describe. Foucault doesn't use those terms, but it's essentially what he's describing: the kind of the neoliberal surveillance state, right? And that the surveillance state actually started in the 18th and 19th centuries as a reaction to controlling the pandemic. And as I was reading this, lectures he gave in the 70s during the global pandemic and writing this book, it really struck me that there was something very similar here, and that we should be very careful with the liberties that we give away in times of emergency, because they tend to not come back, right? And to give powers to the state. Of course, we're not confined anymore, but the powers that the state has taken are then used in other areas, for example, to fight climate activists. And we should be very careful when we transfer these powers to the state, because then they're very difficult to claw back from the state. And so I think Foucault, reasonably speaking, would have been very critical of this securitized approach to the state, not only during the pandemic, that's one example, but also in the reaction to social movements in France that have been, the use of kind of militarized police in order to crush those social movements, the wide use of security services to spy on citizens, etc. All of that is part of this kind of this state security nexus that Foucault was hugely critical of as the kind of pillar of neoliberalism.
Yeah, that must have been quite a bizarre experience, reading through that and then living it at the same time. And what is interesting, I'm not so sure about the French context, but a lot of the powers that Parliament took over to implement, lockdowns and so on, and controlling of people and policing have not been rolled back, so they still exist. And it'd be interesting to see if Labour make any changes. I doubt they will, because they're useful tools to suppress any resistance to the changes they need to make.
Probably not would be the likely answer. It would require a lot of political will and principles in order to reintroduce those freedoms and roll back the state. And I think it's very difficult for a government to do so, especially when it doesn't have many principles.
Just the final one. What does the French election result mean for the UK and the UK's relationship with France? And then what does it mean for the wider European project?
Yeah, I think so. Macron has been very, very vocal on the European project. He's been for creating a European sovereignty, whatever that means, and very vocal about growing the powers of Europe, European Union institutions. He was, for example, during the pandemic, he was backing this kind of power for the Commission to borrow money on bonds markets, and that has gone through in the end. So that has changed the nature of European institutions, not dramatically, but at least a little bit. It has strengthened their power and their ability to run things independently. He's been, of course, very pro-Ukraine, despite an initial flip-flop, right? At the beginning, it wasn't clear which way he was going, but he turned around quite quickly. And so there are fears in France of what if Le Pen comes to power and suddenly, she's accepted money from Russian banks that were linked with the Kremlin. So that there are those fears, right? That suddenly there's going to be, France might not back Ukraine anymore, send weapons and money, and that's a real fear. But the RN is not in power, and like I said, I think it's unlikely they form a government, even in a coalition. So those fears, at least, are for the future. Right, 27 maybe, but until then, not really. But in the meantime, it means Macron is weakened. Macron is unable to really pursue his reforms, and also, depending on who is the prime minister and how strong the opposition is, he might not be able to continue some of these policies simply because if there's any money attached to them, if he needs any money to do anything, which in politics you tend to need money to do things, then the parliament could deny him that source of income. And certainly if there's a prime minister from the opposition, then the prime minister could just say no, right? And the prime minister technically is responsible for the government's policy. there's this kind of unwritten rule in French politics that the president is responsible for defense, but actually the prime minister, according to the constitution, is responsible for defense. So there may be a constitutional clash there, because it's considered to be what the president is responsible for, but there is no rule that says so in the constitution. In fact, there's a rule that says the opposite in the constitution. So it's going to be interesting for sure, but we can expect a weaker Macron, and then we can expect maybe a little bit more leeway for negotiation on the British side, right? Because if Macron is weaker, then he cannot run the kind of very strong like anti-Brexit line that he had during his early days of his presidency, because of course his presidency coincided with the Brexit negotiations, and he had a very heavy hand to play in the kind of hardball that the EU played against the UK, right, in the negotiations. First, it was a Frenchman who was negotiating, Michel Barnier, and also Macron was really pushing, and he was because he thought, right, if we make a strong example out of the UK, then we won't have someone else leaving later, right? The cost of rupture should be high, was his thinking. And so then if there are any kind of renegotiations around, little details, I'm not talking about rejoining the EU, but, taking part in Erasmus, for example, for universities, that can be negotiated. Maybe it would be a little bit easier to negotiate now that Macron is weakened, and especially if it's kind of a bit more neutral, like Erasmus, like he doesn't mind if there's cooperation between universities. So the UK might find a little bit more margin, and if they manage to convince the Germans in particular that something is in Europe's interests, Europe and Britain's interests, then there'll be more margin for negotiation there. But yeah, in terms of bilateral relations, I don't expect a big change. I think generally speaking, the two countries are quite friendly anyway. There's a lot of collaboration that extended well beyond the European Union, and that has continued since. So I would think that bilateral relations will keep going, business as usual.
Thank you so much to Dr. Charles Devellennes for joining us on this very special two-part series of The Political Dispatch.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the recent French elections. But before we go, let's quickly preview our next episode, where we'll be shifting our focus across the Atlantic to the United States of America.
In our upcoming episode, we'll examine the ongoing political upheaval that has gripped America, with Joe Biden bowing out of the presidential race and endorsing Kamala Harris, and Donald Trump surviving an assassination attempt by mere millimeters. The USA is currently in a state of political turmoil unseen in decades. While both parties engage in loaded rhetoric, only time will tell which side is able to handle the crisis better.
How has this tumultuous series of events reshaped the political landscape? What does it mean for the upcoming elections? And how might these developments impact international relations? We'll explore these questions and more from across the pond.
Join us next week for what promises to be a riveting discussion on the Political Dispatch. Until then, stay informed and engaged.